I never thought Kenneth would actually go through with it. I mean, sure, he'd been acting weird for months, giving me those cold little yes and no answers, staying out late, leaving those ridiculous lawyer bills on the kitchen counter like some kind of passive-aggressive teenager. But divorce? Actually sitting me down with that smug little grin and telling me he knew about Maurice? That he wanted to start dating other people? I honestly thought he was bluffing, trying to scare me or something. Men do that sometimes when they want attention, right? They threaten dramatic things they don't really mean. Except Kenneth wasn't threatening. He was just done. And that's what I can't wrap my head around, because 7 months ago when this whole thing with Maurice started, Kenneth and I were fine. We were normal. We had our routine, our life, our kids asking for help with homework and complaining about vegetables at dinner. Everything was perfectly ordinary, which I guess was the problem. I met Maurice at that work conference in Brussels. I wasn't looking for anything, honestly. I was just bored out of my mind listening to presentations about quarterly projections and synergistic solutions, whatever the hell those are. And Maurice was sitting 2 seats over making these little sarcastic comments under his breath that kept making me snort with laughter. He's one of those guys who's funny without trying too hard, you know? Not like Kenneth, who still thinks puns are the height of comedy. Maurice would lean over during the boring parts and whisper these observations about the speakers that were so spot on and mean that I'd have to bite my lip to keep from laughing out loud. By lunch, I was looking forward to sitting next to him. And by the cocktail hour, I was definitely flirting. Not serious flirting, just that harmless kind that makes you feel attractive and interesting again. The kind that reminds you that you're not just someone's wife and someone's mother, but an actual person that men might want to talk to. He asked for my number on the last day, said he traveled to my city sometimes for work, and maybe we could grab coffee. I should have said no. I know I should have said no. But Kenneth had been so predictable lately, so settled into his routine of work and dinner and television in bed, and Maurice made me feel like I was 25 again. So I gave him my number and told myself it was just networking, just being friendly. Professional connections are important in my field. Except when Maurice texted me 2 weeks later, it wasn't about work. It was just to say he'd been thinking about our conversations and did I want to meet up for that coffee? And I said yes, because why not? It was just coffee. Coffee isn't cheating. Coffee is barely anything at all. Except coffee turned into lunch the next week, and lunch turned into these long conversations about everything Kenneth and I never talked about anymore. Maurice reads actual books, not just whatever's trending on Netflix. He has opinions about art and politics and philosophy. He travels to interesting places and does interesting things and makes me feel like maybe I'm interesting too. Instead of just this suburban mom who drives carpool and argues with insurance companies and remembers to buy milk. When I'm with Maurice, I remember who I used to be before I got so caught up in being Kenneth's wife and the kids' mother. I remember that I used to have dreams and ambitions and thoughts that weren't about grocery lists and soccer schedules. The first time we kissed was about 6 weeks after that initial coffee. We were walking through the park after lunch, talking about some documentary he'd recommended, and he just stopped and looked at me with this expression like he was seeing something wonderful. Kenneth hasn't looked at me like that in years. Kenneth looks at me like I'm furniture, familiar and functional, but nothing to really notice. Maurice kissed me like I was precious. Like I was something worth wanting, and I kissed him back because I couldn't remember the last time anyone had made me feel wanted instead of just needed. It felt like waking up after a very long sleep. I told myself it was just a kiss, just one moment of feeling alive again. But then Maurice started texting me every day, sending me articles he thought I'd find interesting, asking about my day like he actually cared about the answer. Kenneth asks about my day the same way he asks about the weather, just making noise to fill the silence. Maurice actually listens when I complain about work or talk about something funny, one of the kids said. He remembers details from previous conversations. He makes me feel heard in a way I'd forgotten was possible. The affair, if you want to call it that, developed so gradually I barely noticed it happening. First it was just coffee, then lunch, then longer walks and deeper conversations. Then it was meeting at his hotel when he was in town for work, just to talk somewhere private where we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. Then it was kissing again, and then more than kissing, and suddenly we were sleeping together, and I was lying to Kenneth about where I'd been and what I was doing. But it didn't feel like lying, exactly. It felt like protecting something beautiful from someone who wouldn't understand. Kenneth wouldn't understand that I needed this, that Maurice makes me feel like myself again. Kenneth would just see it as betrayal, instead of recognizing that maybe if he'd been paying attention to me, if he'd been making an effort to keep me interested and engaged, none of this would have happened. I was careful about it. I'm not stupid. I used a different phone for texting Maurice, kept it in my purse where Kenneth would never think to look. I met Maurice during work hours or when I was supposedly out with friends. I made sure there were no receipts or credit card charges that would raise questions. I thought I was being discreet, protecting everyone from unnecessary drama. Kenneth seemed completely oblivious anyway, going about his normal routine like nothing had changed. He never asked questions about where I'd been or why I was getting home later than usual. He never seemed to notice when I started paying more attention to my appearance, buying new clothes, wearing perfume again. He was just as predictable and inattentive as always. Maurice is married too, which made it easier in some ways. He understood the need for discretion, the importance of keeping our relationships separate from our regular lives. His wife doesn't appreciate him either. She's one of those women who's so focused on the house and the kids that she's forgotten how to be a woman, you know? Maurice says she hasn't initiated sex in over a year, that she treats him like a roommate who helps pay the bills. At least Kenneth and I still have sex sometimes, though it's become pretty routine. Maurice makes me feel desired in a way Kenneth hasn't in years. With Kenneth, sex feels like another item on the to-do list, something to get through so we can go to sleep. With Maurice, it feels like passion, like something worth wanting. I knew I was taking a risk, but I thought I had everything under control. Kenneth never showed any signs of suspicion. He never questioned my schedule or seemed particularly interested in what I was doing when I wasn't home. He just carried on with his usual routine of work and television and weekend projects around the house. I thought if he suspected anything, he would say something. Kenneth's not usually one to keep his feelings to himself. If something's bothering him, he talks about it until I'm sick of hearing about it. So when he stayed quiet, I assumed everything was fine. Looking back now, I can see that Kenneth started changing about 4 months into my relationship with Maurice. He became quieter, more distant. He stopped initiating conversations about his day or asking detailed questions about mine. He started working later, staying out of the house more often. When he was home, he seemed distracted, like his mind was somewhere else. But I was distracted too, thinking about Maurice and when I'd see him next, so I didn't pay much attention to Kenneth's mood. I figured he was just going through one of his phases. Kenneth gets like that sometimes, withdrawn and moody, usually when work is stressing him out. I thought it would pass, like it always does. The kids started asking questions about why Daddy seemed sad all the time. Lucy asked me if Kenneth and I were getting divorced, which seemed to come out of nowhere. I told her not to be silly, that sometimes grown-ups just have things on their minds. But then Hazel started asking similar questions, wondering why Kenneth spent so much time in his office with the door closed, why he didn't watch movies with us anymore on Friday nights. I told them their father was just busy with work, but privately I started wondering if Kenneth was having some kind of midlife crisis. Men do that, right? They get weird and distant and start questioning their lives. I thought maybe he'd work through whatever was bothering him and things would go back to normal. Meanwhile, my relationship with Maurice was getting more intense. We were seeing each other twice a week, sometimes 3 times, when his work brought him to town more frequently. He started talking about leaving his wife, about how much happier he'd be if he could be with someone who really understood him. I wasn't ready to think about anything that dramatic, but it was flattering to hear. Kenneth has never talked about me like I'm essential to his happiness. Kenneth talks about me like I'm a given, something that will always be there, regardless of how much effort he puts in. Maurice talks about me like I'm a choice he makes every day, something precious he doesn't want to lose. I should have realized something was seriously wrong when Kenneth stopped engaging with me almost entirely. For the last few months, he's barely spoken to me except when absolutely necessary. When I ask him questions, he gives me these flat, emotionless responses like he can't be bothered to have an actual conversation. When I try to talk about the kids or plans for the weekend, he just nods and makes non-committal noises. It was like living with a polite stranger who happened to share my house. But I was so caught up in the excitement of my relationship with Maurice that I didn't really process how strange Kenneth's behavior had become. I thought maybe he was depressed or having work problems. I thought maybe he was just going through a rough patch and would snap out of it eventually. Then Kenneth started leaving those lawyer bills where I couldn't miss them. Consultation fees, retainer agreements, paperwork about asset division and custody arrangements. I thought he was trying to scare me, maybe because he'd figured out something was going on and wanted to shock me into confessing. Men do that sometimes, right? They make dramatic gestures to get attention, to force conversations they don't know how to start. I thought if I just ignored the bills and acted normal, Kenneth would realize he was being ridiculous and we'd go back to our regular routine. I never imagined he was actually serious about divorce. Kenneth doesn't make big decisions quickly. Kenneth researches everything to death and asks for everyone's opinion before he commits to anything. The idea that he would just decide to end our marriage without even talking to me about it seemed impossible. Even when he had that conversation with the kids about how sometimes grown-ups can't be together anymore, I thought he was just trying to get my attention. It seemed like such an extreme thing to do, involving the children in whatever midlife crisis he was having. I was right there listening to him give them that whole speech about how we both love them, and it's not their fault. And I kept waiting for him to look at me, to give me some sign that this was all just a ploy to make me take him seriously. But he never looked at me. He just talked to Lucy and Hazel like I wasn't even in the room, like the decision had already been made without any input from me. It was infuriating, honestly. Who does he think he is, making unilateral decisions about our family? I figured Kenneth would eventually get tired of whatever game he was playing, and we'd have a real conversation about what was bothering him. I thought maybe he was feeling neglected or taken for granted, which would be ironic considering how little effort he's put into our relationship lately. But I was prepared to make more of an effort if that's what he needed. I could cut back on my time with Maurice, focus more on Kenneth and the kids. I could be more attentive, more appreciative. I just needed Kenneth to tell me what he wanted instead of sulking around the house like a teenager. But then Kenneth came home a few days ago with this expression I'd never seen before. Not angry, not hurt, just satisfied, like he'd won something. He asked me to sit down because we needed to talk, and he had this little smile that made my stomach clench. This wasn't Kenneth being dramatic for attention. This was Kenneth, who had made up his mind about something and was pleased with his decision. He told me he'd known about my affair for months, that he'd figured it out almost from the beginning. He said he'd spent the last few months preparing for divorce and planning his new life without me. He said he wanted to start dating other people and it was time for us to officially separate. The way he said it was so calm, so matter-of-fact, like he was discussing weekend plans or what to have for dinner. There was no emotion in his voice at all, no anger or hurt or sadness. Just this flat, business-like tone, like I was a problem he'd finally figured out how to solve. He said he assumed I'd be happy about the divorce since I was obviously more interested in Maurice than in our family. He said I could be with Maurice without guilt now, like he was doing me some kind of favor by setting me free. I couldn't understand what was happening. This wasn't how these conversations were supposed to go. Kenneth was supposed to be upset, demanding explanations, asking me to choose between him and Maurice. He was supposed to fight for our marriage, not just calmly announce that he was done with it. I tried to explain that the affair didn't mean anything, that it was just something that happened, not something I'd planned or wanted. I told him we could go to counseling, that we could fix this if we both tried. But Kenneth just looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. He said if I'd wanted to fix our marriage, I should have talked to him 7 months ago instead of starting an affair. He said there was no way to undo what I'd done, no way to unscrew Maurice, which was such a crude way to put it. He said he didn't believe I'd ever really cared about him because someone who cared wouldn't have put him through this kind of pain. He said my telling him I loved him had no credibility because my actions proved otherwise. It was like he'd been rehearsing this speech for months, like he'd thought through every possible thing I might say and prepared responses designed to shut down any hope of reconciliation. The worst part was how indifferent he seemed. I could have handled anger, even hatred. I could have worked with emotion, found ways to reach him and make him understand. But Kenneth wasn't angry or hurt anymore. He was just done. Like I was a problem he'd already solved in his mind, a chapter of his life he was ready to close. He kept talking about co-parenting and being civil for the sake of the children, like our marriage was already over, and we were just working out the practical details. I started crying, really crying, the kind of desperate sobbing that comes from somewhere deep in your chest. This couldn't be happening. Kenneth and I have been together for 12 years. We have a house and children and a whole life together. You don't just throw that away because of one mistake, one period of poor judgment. People work through infidelity all the time. People go to counseling and rebuild trust and come out stronger than before. Kenneth was acting like our marriage was completely beyond repair, like there was no possibility of forgiveness or second chances. I tried to explain that I never meant for any of this to happen, that the affair just evolved gradually without me really thinking through the consequences. I tried to tell him that I'd been feeling lonely and unappreciated, that Maurice made me feel special in ways I'd forgotten were possible. I tried to make him understand that it wasn't about not loving him. It was about needing something he wasn't giving me. But Kenneth just stared at me with this cold, distant expression like nothing I said mattered at all. He said I should have talked to him if I was unhappy instead of having an affair. He said he wasn't a mind reader, that he couldn't fix problems he didn't know existed. He said that by choosing to sleep with Maurice instead of addressing whatever was wrong in our marriage, I'd made it clear that I thought our relationship was beyond saving. He said if I was willing to risk destroying our family for Maurice, then Maurice must be more important to me than my husband and children. The logic was so twisted, so black and white. Kenneth was making it sound like I deliberately set out to destroy our marriage, when really I'd just been trying to feel alive again. I became completely hysterical at some point, crying so hard I couldn't form coherent sentences. Kenneth just sat there watching me fall apart with no expression on his face at all. Finally, he called my sister Lucy to come get me, like I was some kind of mental patient who couldn't be trusted to take care of herself. When Lucy arrived, Kenneth explained the situation in that same calm, detached tone, like he was reporting on something that had happened to other people. Lucy looked shocked and disappointed, which made everything worse. Even my own sister was taking Kenneth's side, treating me like I was the villain in this situation. Lucy drove me to her house and let me cry on her couch for hours while she made disapproving comments about how I'd thrown away a good marriage for some meaningless fling. She kept asking what I'd been thinking, how I could risk everything for someone who wasn't even available. She said Kenneth was a good man who didn't deserve this kind of betrayal, that I was lucky he was being so civilized about the divorce instead of trying to destroy me in court. Everyone acts like Kenneth is some kind of saint for not screaming at me or calling me names. But what about what I need? What about the fact that I've been unhappy for years and no one seemed to care about that? I've been staying at Lucy's for 3 days now, while Kenneth makes arrangements for the separation. He's already filed preliminary paperwork, already started the process of dividing our assets and working out custody schedules. He's treating our divorce like a business transaction, something to be handled efficiently rather than emotionally. When I called to ask if we could talk again, if I could come home and try to work things out. He said there was nothing left to discuss. He said I'd made my choice 7 months ago, and now he was making his. The thing I can't understand is how Kenneth can just turn off 12 years of marriage like flipping a switch. How can he go from being my husband to being this cold, distant stranger who talks about co-parenting arrangements and asset division? How can he be so certain that our marriage is over without even trying to save it? People make mistakes. People have affairs and work through them and rebuild their relationships. Kenneth is acting like what I did is unforgivable, like there's no possibility of redemption or second chances. Maurice has been texting me constantly, asking what's happening and when we can see each other again. He says he's ready to leave his wife now, that this could be the fresh start we've both been wanting. But the idea of being with Maurice permanently, of building a real relationship instead of just having these stolen moments, doesn't feel as exciting as it did a week ago. Maurice was perfect as an escape from my regular life, but I'm not sure I want him to become my regular life. He's never seen me deal with sick children or argue about bills or navigate the boring, mundane parts of a long-term relationship. What if the magic between us doesn't survive the transition from affair to actual partnership? And what about Lucy and Hazel? They're gonna hate me for breaking up their family. They're going to blame me for making their father so sad, for forcing them to split their time between 2 houses and deal with custody schedules and step-parents. Kenneth gets to be the victim in this situation, the wronged party who tried his best to hold the family together. I'm going to be the selfish mother who chose her own happiness over her children's stability. That's not fair. That's not the whole story. But Kenneth has already controlled the narrative, already positioned himself as the reasonable one who's handling an impossible situation with grace and maturity. I keep thinking there has to be a way to fix this. Some combination of words or actions that will make Kenneth realize he's overreacting. Marriage is about forgiveness, about working through problems together. Kenneth is acting like my affair was some kind of deliberate attack on him personally, instead of recognizing that it was really about my own unhappiness and loneliness. If he'd been paying more attention to me, if he'd been making an effort to keep our relationship interesting and passionate, none of this would have happened. But Kenneth doesn't want to examine his own role in the breakdown of our marriage. He just wants to blame everything on me and walk away feeling righteous about it. The lawyer Kenneth hired is apparently some kind of shark who specializes in cases involving infidelity. Lucy says Kenneth has documentation of my affair, evidence that will make it impossible for me to claim any kind of spousal support. In our country, adultery affects the financial settlement, which means I could end up with much less than I would have gotten in a no-fault divorce. Kenneth planned this whole thing carefully, gathering evidence while I thought he was just being moody and distant. He was building a case against me while I was falling in love with someone else, preparing to destroy me financially and emotionally while I thought our marriage was just going through a rough patch. I never intended for any of this to happen. 7 months ago, I was just a bored wife, looking for a little excitement, a little reminder that I was still an attractive, interesting woman. I never meant to fall for Maurice, or to hurt Kenneth, or to break up our family. It just happened gradually, one small decision leading to another, until suddenly I was in too deep to find my way back. But Kenneth doesn't care about my intentions or the complicated emotions that led to the affair. He only cares about the facts. I slept with another man for 7 months and lied about it. In his mind, that's all that matters. The worst part is that Kenneth seems genuinely happy about the divorce. When Lucy drove me by the house to pick up some clothes, I saw him in the yard playing with Lucy and Hazel, actually laughing and smiling in a way I haven't seen in months. It's like ending our marriage has lifted some huge weight off his shoulders, like he's relieved to be free of me. He's already talking about selling the house and finding a place that's just his, somewhere he can start over without any reminders of our life together. Meanwhile, I'm falling apart, staying on my sister's couch and crying myself to sleep every night, and Kenneth is making plans for his bright new future. I heard through Lucy that Kenneth has been in touch with some woman from his past, someone he knew before we met. Apparently they ran into each other recently, and there was some kind of spark between them. She's single and interested, and Kenneth told her he'd call as soon as the divorce was finalized. So while I'm dealing with lawyers and custody arrangements and the complete destruction of everything I thought was permanent in my life, Kenneth is already planning his next relationship. It's like our 12 years together meant nothing to him, like I'm just an obstacle that was preventing him from finding real happiness. Everyone keeps telling me this is what I should have expected, that actions have consequences, and I brought this on myself. But I never thought Kenneth would actually leave me. I thought he loved me enough to fight for our marriage, to work through this difficult period, and come out stronger on the other side. I thought the affair would be a wake-up call for both of us, a sign that we needed to pay more attention to each other and put more effort into keeping our relationship exciting. I never imagined Kenneth would just give up on us completely. Now I'm facing the reality of being a divorced single mother with limited financial resources and a reputation as the woman who cheated on her devoted husband. Maurice is still pushing for us to be together officially, but I'm starting to see him differently now that the secrecy and excitement are gone. Without the thrill of the forbidden, he's just another middle-aged man with his own set of problems and complications. The passion that felt so overwhelming when we were sneaking around feels less compelling now that it's caused the complete destruction of my stable, comfortable life. Kenneth was right about one thing. There's no way to undo what I've done. I can't unsleep with Maurice. Can't take back 7 months of lies and deception. I can't restore Kenneth's trust or rebuild his love for me. I can't give Lucy and Hazel back their intact family or spare them the pain of watching their parents tear each other apart in court. All I can do now is try to salvage whatever pieces of my life are left and figure out how to build something new from the wreckage of everything I've destroyed.